I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. My daughter Emma was coming over, and for once it was supposed to be just the two of us. No work, no meetings, no chaos. Just coffee, board games, and long overdue mother-daughter conversations. I smiled as I watched her car pull into the driveway, imagining her hopping out, tossing me a bright, "Hi, Mom," and throwing her bags into the house. But of course, nothing in life or in this neighborhood ever goes as planned. Before Emma could even put her car in park, I noticed her freeze, hand on the steering wheel. My eyes followed hers, and there she was, HOA Karen. And when I say Karen, I don't mean the friendly kind of neighbor who borrows sugar. I mean the woman who patrols our cul-de-sac like a self-appointed sheriff of moral and aesthetic conduct, armed with a clipboard and an attitude that could intimidate a drill sergeant. She was standing at the edge of the driveway, squinting through her glasses, lips pursed, like she had personally detected some crime before it even happened. And she had. In her mind, the crime was Emma parking in my driveway. "Unauthorized visitor," she muttered under her breath as if she were the only one who knew how serious this was. And then, as if rehearsed for a drama she only saw herself starring in, she whipped out her phone and started dialing. My stomach sank. "Oh no," I whispered to Emma. She glanced at me confused. "Mom, is she calling the cops?" "Yes, yes she is," I said, trying to stay calm. But even in my calmness, I felt a bubbling mix of disbelief and irritation. All I could think was, this is my daughter, my home, and you are calling law enforcement over her visit. By the time Emma got out of the car, Karen was in full lecture mode. Arms crossed, clipboard held like a shield, she began listing rules as if they were holy commandments handed down by some HOA deity. "You're not supposed to visit without prior notice. You can't park here without a permit. Neighborhood safety is paramount." Emma blinked at her, utterly speechless, while I tried to mask my growing frustration with a polite, "Karen, she's my daughter. She's visiting." But Karen wasn't having it. She waved her hands, jabbing them for emphasis, her voice sharp and insistent. "I'm just doing my duty, I'm protecting the community." She sounded serious, but to me, it was almost laughable. Protecting the community by terrifying my child. Somehow, I doubted that was in the HOA manual. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching. Two police cars rolled slowly down the street, lights off, just enough to indicate that someone had indeed called for backup. Emma froze in the driveway, and I felt the tension in my chest tighten. I walked toward the street, trying to act casual, like this was just another one of those absurd suburban misunderstandings. "Officers," I said, trying to keep my tone calm, "this is my daughter. She's visiting me for the weekend." Karen, naturally, jumped in mid-sentence. "It's a violation. Unauthorized visitor. Rules are rules." She held up her clipboard like a shield of righteousness, scanning through some imaginary law book she'd clearly written in her head. The officers glanced between me and Karen, eyebrows raised, clearly unsure how to navigate this situation. I could almost hear them thinking, is this a serious complaint or just another HOA meltdown? Emma, meanwhile, had decided that if life was going to be absurd, she might as well embrace it. She gave me a half-smile, like she was silently saying, "This is going to be one of those stories we'll laugh about later." But my mind was racing. Something told me that Karen had no idea who she was messing with, and that thought brought a small, grim smile to my face. This weekend, which had started as coffee and laughter, was about to become a impatience, control, and maybe even a little revenge. Because sometimes, you have to let the storm arrive to see who's standing firm, and right now, I was standing at the eye of a very ridiculous hurricane called Karen. And I knew, deep down, this was only the beginning. The wail of sirens faded into the background as two uniformed officers stepped out of their cars, badges gleaming, eyes scanning the scene like they had just stumbled into a suburban circus. One was tall and serious, the other younger, looking both bored and mildly confused. Emma and I exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that this was already absurd. Karen, of course, wasted no time. She marched up to the officers, clipboard clutched like it was the stone. They're in violation. Unauthorized visitor, potential threat to neighborhood security. This is serious, she declared, her voice rising like an opera soprano hitting a high note. The tall officer tilted his head politely. Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what happened? Karen looked shocked that anyone would even question her. Exactly what happened. I'm just doing my duty. Rules are rules. They, she pointed at Emma, are breaking them as we speak. Emma, trying not to laugh, gave me a side glance that screamed, Mom, are we actually in the middle of a sitcom right now? I stepped forward, smiling politely, and said, Officers, this is my daughter Emma. She's visiting me for the weekend. That's it. Karen flailed her hands as if I'd just insulted the very foundation of the universe. You can't just have visitors, without prior notice. And what about neighborhood safety? You're supposed to submit a request form. There's a process. I took a slow breath, letting her words wash over me. Part of me wanted to laugh, part of me wanted to scream. I could practically see the neighbors peeking through their blinds, probably betting on how long it would take for Karen to implode. The younger officer scratched his head. Ma'am, this isn't really a criminal matter. The HOA has rules, sure, but this doesn't really. Karen cut him off. It doesn't matter, someone has to enforce them. We can't let anarchy take over. Who's next? Children riding bikes without helmets. People leaving trash cans out overnight. She was shaking now, pointing at random objects like they were evidence of some suburban apocalypse. I kept my voice calm, almost teasingly calm. Karen, I understand your concern for safety, but Emma is my daughter. She lives out of state. She's here for 2 days. There's no law being broken. This isn't a security issue, it's a family visit. Karen's face contorted. She looked like a cat caught in a bath. Family visits, without notice. Do you think rules don't apply to you? Emma couldn't help it. She whispered under her breath, This is insane. I shot her a look that said, Exactly. But I kept my composure. There's a certain satisfaction in letting someone's arrogance carry them straight into their own trap. The officers, meanwhile, exchanged awkward glances. The taller one was trying to maintain professional neutrality. The younger one looked like he wanted popcorn. Karen, sensing she was losing control, started waving her arms even more. This is an outrage. Someone has to take responsibility. If I let this slide, everyone will think it's okay. What about the precedent? I smiled politely, letting her words hang in the air like a thick fog. Karen, I said softly, deliberately slow so everyone could hear, I assure you the precedent has nothing to do with this situation. Emma is here, that's all. And we are not breaking any laws. Karen's eyes narrowed. You think you can just ignore the rules? I leaned in slightly, letting a small smirk show. I don't think Karen, I know. Her lips twitched, like she was trying to maintain composure but failing spectacularly. I could feel the tension thickening. The neighbors were now fully invested, some peeking through blinds, others leaning out on their porches. The absurdity of the situation was so palpable it could be sliced with a knife. And then I realized something important. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no clue that I was not just the neighbor across the street, that I wasn't just some civilian she could intimidate with her self-righteous rules. She was poking a hornet's nest without knowing it. I took a slow breath, letting the officers see my calm demeanor. I let Karen rant a little more, enough to make her think she had the upper hand, but inside, I was already planning the next move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension in the driveway hung like a storm cloud, charged and ready to break. Every word Karen spoke made her look more ridiculous, yet also made it clear that the next few moments would decide the weekend's fate, and maybe teach Karen a lesson she'd never forget. And that's when I knew, deep down, this encounter would be the story Emma and I laughed about later, once the dust settled and the tables had turned. As Karen's ranting continued, I took a moment to step back and observe, not because I wanted to, but because survival in these situations requires patience and strategy. I've lived in this neighborhood for years, long enough to memorize the patterns of Karen's behavior. And oh, what a pattern it is. She thrives on rules that nobody else can remember, and she enforces them with the zeal of someone who believes she's protecting the world from impending doom. The crooked garden gnome 2 streets over, she fined the homeowner. A mailbox that dared to be painted red instead of beige, another violation. A child who accidentally left a basketball in the driveway after sunset. You guessed it, another warning letter. Neighbors have learned to tiptoe around her, half in fear, half in amusement. Some whisper behind her back, recounting the absurdity of her overreach. Others quietly document every encounter, knowing someday the universe, or karma, will catch up to her. And now, watching her wag her clipboard at my daughter, I realized it had finally come to my driveway. Emma, bless her heart, was still standing there, wide-eyed, trying to understand why a woman could be so obsessed with controlling other people's lives. "Mom," she whispered, "she's insane." I didn't correct her. Insanity was the polite word. I had learned long ago that arguing with Karen is like debating a brick wall, pointless, exhausting, and ultimately hilarious if you don't take it personally. Instead, I let her speak, keeping my tone calm, my expression neutral. Let her exhaust herself. Let her think she's winning. It's remarkable how predictable she is. Every time she senses a challenge to her authority, she doubles down. Every threat of "I'll call the HOA, I'll call the cops, I'll write a 15-page complaint," is just another attempt to intimidate. And for years, she's been sharpening that intimidation like a sword, cutting down neighbors. Confidence one unnecessary fine at a time. I thought back to last month, when she stormed into the Johnsons' yard over a single blue flower in their otherwise pristine garden. She cited some obscure clause that barely existed and demanded immediate correction. The Johnsons, of course, after all, who wants a Karen-sized fine hanging over their head. And yet, every time she thinks she's victorious, there's a tiny crack in her armor. The smug satisfaction of absolute control never lasts. I realized that my situation was a perfect storm. My daughter is visiting, Karen is already on high alert, and I happen to be a little more than an average neighbor. She doesn't know who she's dealing with. She doesn't know that when she pushes, she risks overplaying her hand in spectacular fashion. And that's when I felt a strange, satisfying calm wash over me. Emma looked at me, still whispering, "So she's like a HOA supervillain." I couldn't help but chuckle. Exactly, and every supervillain has a weakness. The officers, meanwhile, were lingering awkwardly, caught between professionalism and the absurdity of the situation. They were watching me, probably trying to figure out if I'd escalate things or diffuse them. I gave them a small, reassuring smile. There would be no escalation from me, not yet. Part of this, I knew, was letting Karen overextend herself until she made a mistake she couldn't recover from. Karen, of course, didn't know she was walking into a trap. Every accusation, every wag of her finger, every reference to rules she could barely recite, was painting her into a corner. Her energy was frantic now, and her voice was climbing an octave with each sentence. "I've never had anyone ignore my directives like this. Do you know what this means for the neighborhood?" I decided it was time to shift the tone ever so slightly. "Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm, "Emma is my daughter. She's visiting. Nothing here is violating any laws. You don't need to involve the police for family visits." She blinked at me like my words were incomprehensible. You think you can just ignore rules." I let a small smirk tug at the corner of my mouth. I wasn't about to reveal everything just yet, but the tension in the air was palpable. Karen was flailing, the officers were uneasy, Emma was half in awe, half in amusement, and I felt the first stirrings of anticipation. Because now the stage was set. Karen had shown her true colors. She had overreached. And I, for the first time in this little suburban saga, felt the scales of control tipping in my favor. The suspense wasn't just for me. It was for everyone watching from their windows, eavesdropping on the absurdity of someone taking neighborhood rules so seriously that they forgot the most important rule of all: human decency. And as I looked at Emma and then back at Karen, I knew the weekend had officially begun. The calm, the games, the laughter, all of that was still ahead. But first, Karen needed to learn a lesson she would never forget. And that lesson, my friends, would come in its own perfect, dramatic, and slightly satisfying way. By now, the scene in my driveway looked like something out of a suburban soap opera. Karen had shifted into full-blown authority mode, clipboard held high, lips pursed in that "I am right and you are wrong" expression she perfected over the years. Her voice was sharp, precise, and endlessly exhausting. "I need to see identification, both of you, and I need to verify your right to be here. Rules are rules. Neighborhood safety is not optional." Emma froze. I could see the panic flicker in her eyes, the same panic I had felt as a child when dealing with overzealous school administrators. But this wasn't school, and it certainly wasn't some petty neighbor squabble. This was Karen at her absolute peak, and she didn't realize that every move she made was only tightening the noose around herself. I walked forward, deliberately calm, letting her think she had the upper hand. I kept my tone polite, measured, because there's a certain art to letting someone flail before you reveal the truth. "Karen," I said softly, "Emma is my daughter. She lives out of state. She's visiting for 2 days. There is no violation here, no law being broken. You don't need to see identification." Her jaw tightened. She raised an eyebrow, scanning me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve. You think you're above the rules." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying a mix of rage and fear. Emma whispered, almost to herself, "Mom, what do we do?" I placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Nothing," I whispered back. "Just watch." The officers were still standing there, awkwardly hovering. The taller one, maintaining a professional neutral face, tried to intervene. "Ma'am, this doesn't really require verification. The HOA has rules, yes, but there's no criminal violation here." Karen's eyes darted to the officers, fury flashing. "This is serious. You don't understand. Someone has to enforce the rules or the neighborhood will fall apart." I let her rant, quietly savoring the spectacle. She was spiraling, each word she spat tightening the tension around her like a vice. The officers exchanged glances, and I could see them wondering how far this ridiculousness would go. Even the neighbors had started peeking out from behind curtains and fences, drawn in by the dramatic energy of the confrontation. Karen, sensing she might be losing control, tried a different tactic. "You must have forms, registration forms, permission slips, anything, you're violating the covenants." She waved her arms wildly, clipboard shaking as if that could summon the authority of the HOA gods. I smiled calmly. "Karen, there are no forms. Emma is my daughter, you're overstepping your authority. Nothing you're demanding is legally binding." Her face twisted in confusion, a dangerous combination of disbelief and frustration. The officers, sensing the absurdity, shifted uneasily. I decided it was time to let her think she still had a chance. Sometimes, letting someone overextend themselves is far more effective than confronting them directly. Karen, now visibly flustered, took a step closer, voice rising. "I don't understand. You're supposed to comply. You can't just ignore the rules. This sets a precedent." I tilted my head slightly, letting a small smirk form. "Karen, I assure you the precedent is irrelevant here. Emma is visiting her mother, that's all. You have no authority to dictate otherwise." Her eyes narrowed. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying desperately to find some loophole or obscure rule that could justify her outrage. But there was none. And in that moment, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The officers, still hovering, looked like they were waiting for the storm to pass, or for someone to finally blow their top. Emma, unable to contain herself any longer, whispered, "This is insane. She really thinks she's in charge of everything." I chuckled quietly. "Exactly, and that's why this is going to be interesting." Karen's flailing had now reached a peak of dramatic absurdity. She was pointing at random objects. At the street, at Emma, at me, as if every inch of suburban space belonged to her rulebook. And I realized something important. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She didn't know that patience, calm, and timing were my allies. She didn't know that every word she uttered was setting herself up for a moment she would never forget. The tension crackled like static electricity. The neighbors were watching. Emma was silently trying to hide her laughter. The officers were trying to remain professional, and Karen was on the brink of complete meltdown. And I knew, in that charged moment, that the weekend was only beginning, and that the next steps I took would decide whether Karen learned her lesson or continued to parade around as the self-appointed ruler of our street. By now, Karen was fully in her element, or at least she thought she was. Her voice had risen to a level that could probably be heard a block away, and her arms were waving so much that I half expected the clipboard to take flight like a paper airplane. Neighbors had quietly emerged from behind curtains, leaning over fences, watching the spectacle like it was the most dramatic reality show they'd ever witnessed. I decided it was time to step in, but not with confrontation. Calmness, I knew, was far more disarming than anger. There's a subtle power in remaining composed when everyone else is flailing, and I intended to use it to the fullest. Karen, I said slowly, my voice steady, almost soothing, I understand that you take your responsibilities seriously. That's admirable, but you are overstepping. Emma is my daughter. She is visiting me. There is no law being broken, no neighborhood code being violated. Nothing here requires enforcement. Her face twisted in disbelief. She opened her mouth, clearly ready to argue, but I held up a hand in a subtle gesture of calm authority. That was the moment I realized the tension in the air was almost palpable, so thick you could cut it with a knife. Every neighbor, every officer, even Emma, was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. You don't understand, Karen said, her voice shaky now. If I let this happen, everyone will think it's acceptable. The rules exist for a reason. What about precedent, neighborhood safety? I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. Karen had no idea she was stepping into a chess match, and she had just made the first blunder. Patience, timing, and subtlety were my tools, and she was handing me the advantage. I leaned slightly closer, keeping my tone calm but deliberate. Karen, precedent doesn't matter here. Emma is my daughter. You're focused on paperwork, forms, and rules that only exist in your mind. The situation is simple. She is visiting me, that's all. And while I appreciate your concern for the neighborhood, I assure you that your intervention is unnecessary. Her mouth opened again, but words seemed to fail her. The officers, now more relaxed, exchanged glances and muttered under their breath. It was clear they were seeing the absurdity of the situation for themselves. Emma, standing beside me, whispered, "Mom, are you seriously letting her flail like this?" I smiled a little wryly. Yes, it's more effective this way. Let her exhaust herself. The more she rants, the clearer it becomes that she's overstepping. Karen, however, was not finished. She raised her voice, fingers pointing dramatically at random spots, at Emma, at me, at the street itself. I am enforcing rules. This is serious. You can't just ignore me. Someone has to be responsible. I took a deep breath, letting the suspense hang in the air. She thought she was in control, but every word, every gesture, every flailing motion only made her look increasingly desperate. It was almost artful, watching her unravel. The tension among the officers, neighbors, and even Emma was electric. They could sense that something was about to happen, even if they didn't know what. I decided to give her one last chance to recognize the absurdity. "Karen," I said gently, "let me make this simple. Emma is visiting. You have no authority to dictate otherwise. Continuing this confrontation serves no one, not me, not you, and certainly not the neighborhood you claim to protect." Her eyes widened, the gears in her head spinning wildly. She was realizing, slowly but surely, that she had miscalculated. And that's when I felt it, the subtle, thrilling anticipation of the next move. Patience had brought me this far, and now the moment of revelation was approaching. Every element of the scene, the tense officers, the watchful neighbors, Emma's barely contained laughter, and Karen's spiraling energy was perfectly aligned. All that remained was the final step, revealing just enough to turn the tables completely without ever needing to raise my voice or lose composure. And that's when I knew, with quiet certainty, that the weekend and Karen's understanding of authority would never be the same again. Because sometimes, the people hold the sharpest power, and sometimes, all it takes is the right timing to let someone realize they've underestimated exactly who they're dealing with. The storm was coming, and I was ready. The tension in the driveway had reached a level that could have been measured on the scale. Karen was packing, clipboard clutched like a shield, eyes darting between Emma, me, and the officers as if she were trying to locate some invisible loophole that could justify her meltdown. The neighbors had completely emerged from hiding, peering over fences, leaning out of windows, their attention riveted by the unfolding drama. Emma was standing beside me, looking both alarmed and amused. I could see the mental calculations running through her mind. How did Mom handle HOA Karen before? How long until this blows over? And I had to admit, I was enjoying the suspense too, the quiet, controlled anticipation of the next move. Karen, now visibly flustered, jabbed her finger at me. You can't just ignore the rules, you don't understand. If everyone acted like this, the neighborhood. I raised my hand gently, stopping her mid-rant. I let my calmness speak louder than any words I could say. I let the silence stretch just enough to make her uncomfortable. The officers shifted slightly, leaning in, sensing the tension. Even the neighbors held their breath, waiting. And then I spoke. Karen, I said, my voice steady, calm, almost casual. You seem very concerned about rules and authority. I respect that. She blinked at me, waiting, clearly expecting a pause, a concession, or some form of submission. I continued, but it's important that we all understand the limits of that authority. I tilted my head slightly, allowing a small, deliberate pause. Karen's brow furrowed. She was trying to anticipate what was coming, like a chess player realizing she might have missed a move. And since you're so concerned about proper enforcement of rules, I let my words hang in the air. I should probably clarify something. Emma is my daughter. She is visiting me for the weekend. And I am a federal judge. The world seemed to pause. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, like she was trying to form a coherent thought. The officers blinked, their jaws tightening. The neighbors leaned farther over their fences. Emma froze, a mixture of awe and barely contained laughter on her face. Karen's face turned pale, and her hands dropped, the clipboard wobbling slightly in her grip. What? She stammered. I smiled faintly, letting the suspense stretch a beat longer. I am a federal judge, Karen. So while I appreciate your concern for the neighborhood, your attempt to enforce imaginary violations on my property is misguided. Her eyes went wide, and for a moment she looked as if she might faint. She seemed to be processing the words, trying to find a loophole, a technicality, anything that could salvage her dignity. There wasn't one. The taller officer cleared his throat, trying to maintain professionalism. Ma'am, we understand the situation now, he said, glancing at Karen with a mix of sympathy and incredulity. Emma, trying not to laugh outright, whispered, Mom, you're amazing. I gave her a small nod. The tension that had been coiling around us for the past hour started to dissipate. Karen's voice, once sharp and authoritative, had shriveled to a squeak. I didn't realize, she stammered, words failing her entirely. I let her pause, letting the neighbors witness the full effect of her overreach being met with calm authority. This was the moment that would forever alter her understanding of who held real power on the street. Karen's energy collapsed entirely, like a balloon deflating. Her attempts to maintain her self-appointed role of enforcer had collided headfirst with reality. The officers, still professional but now clearly entertained, nodded politely, and Emma and I exchanged a glance that said everything: justice, patience, and timing win. The suspense had reached its peak, and the payoff was quiet, yet perfect. Karen, the self-righteous arbiter of driveway law, was undone not by shouting, not by argument, but by the calm, precise revelation of truth. As the neighborhood watched, I finally stepped aside, letting Emma walk past Karen and into the house. The cops nodded politely and returned to their vehicles. Karen stood there, still trembling slightly, as the reality sank in. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Sometimes, the greatest power isn't in raising your voice, issuing fines, or brandishing authority. It's in calm control, timing, and letting the other person's ego do the work for you. The storm had arrived, raged, and dissipated, and we were left standing in the calm after the perfect suburban hurricane. The air in my driveway felt electric, almost as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Karen had been packing, waving her clipboard, and lecturing us as though she were conducting a military operation. Her voice had climbed several octaves, shaking with urgency and righteous indignation. The neighbors had finally emerged, leaning over fences and peeking from windows, drawn by the escalating spectacle. Emma and I were silent, letting Karen expend all her energy, knowing full well that patience was our secret weapon. "You can't just ignore the rules," Karen screeched, pointing wildly at me then at Emma. "Someone has to enforce the covenants. This is serious. Neighborhood safety is at stake." Emma muttered under her breath, "Mom, this is insane." I gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Exactly," I whispered, "but also perfectly timed." Karen's ranting had reached a fever pitch. The officers standing nearby were caught in the middle, trying to maintain professionalism while clearly wondering if they had stumbled into some bizarre suburban reality show. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, perhaps we can resolve this without escalating." Karen cut him off, flailing her hands. "No, this is an outrage. You have to enforce the rules. They can't just do whatever they want." I stepped forward, letting my calm presence contrast with Karen's frantic energy. I knew the tension had to peak before the reveal. Every eye in the driveway was on me now, waiting for the next move. My heart beat steadily, but my voice remained measured, deliberate, and calm. "Karen," I began softly, "I understand your concern. Rules are important. Neighborhood safety is important, but perhaps you've forgotten one very simple truth." She blinked, her mouth opening slightly, unsure of what I was about to say. I let a pause hang in the air, just long enough for her to feel the weight of anticipation. The neighbors leaned closer to see the outcome, the officers stiffened, and Emma's eyes widened with curiosity. "And that truth," I continued, "is that Emma is my daughter. She is visiting me for the weekend. She is here legally, and there is no violation of any law or HOA covenant." Karen's expression wavered. Her lips trembled, and the clipboard in her hands shook ever so slightly. I don't understand." I took a slow, deliberate breath. "Perhaps it will help if I add a bit more context," I said, letting the suspense build further. "You see, I'm not just a neighbor, I am a federal judge." The words landed like a lightning strike. Karen froze mid-gesture, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The officers blinked, momentarily stunned, and the neighbors gasped quietly, some leaning over fences to confirm they weren't imagining it. Even Emma's jaw dropped slightly before she burst into quiet laughter. Karen's face turned pale, and for a moment she looked as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. You're a judge," she stammered, clutching her clipboard as though it might protect her from the truth. I nodded, keeping my tone calm and measured. "Yes, Karen, a federal judge. And while I appreciate your enthusiasm for neighborhood safety, you've just overstepped your authority on my property." The tension was almost cinematic. Karen's attempts to regain control faltered with each word I spoke. She looked around helplessly, realizing that the power she thought she wielded was entirely imaginary when confronted with real authority. The officers exchanged glances, clearly trying to maintain professionalism, but their expressions betrayed a mixture of awe and suppressed amusement. Even Emma, standing next to me, shook her head with a grin. "Wow, Mom, this is incredible." Karen's voice, once booming with self-assured authority, had shrunk to a squeak. I didn't know." I let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the reveal to sink in fully. The neighbors watched in stunned fascination, some whispering to one another, others simply shaking their heads. Karen's ego, once towering, had collapsed entirely under the weight of reality. Finally, I gestured toward the house, keeping my tone calm but firm. Emma, come inside. This weekend is for family, not for imaginary HOA trials. Emma grinned, and as she walked past Karen into the house, I watched the entire situation unfold like a perfectly orchestrated play. Karen was still frozen, the officers were politely stepping back, and the neighbors had the perfect story to share at every barbecue for the next decade. I realized then that sometimes, the greatest power isn't in yelling or issuing fines. It's in patience, calm authority, timing, and letting someone else's arrogance do all the work for you. Karen had underestimated me completely, and the consequences were immediate and unavoidable. The storm had reached its peak. The reveal had landed, and the calm after that storm promised a weekend of laughter, stories, and perhaps a newfound respect from a certain clipboard-wielding neighbor, though I doubted she would admit it anytime soon. Karen stood there in stunned silence, the clipboard slipping from her hands and clattering to the driveway like the final drumbeat of a losing battle. For the first time in years, she had no words, no authority, no leverage, just the cold realization that she had completely misjudged the situation. The neighbors had gathered now, quietly watching from behind fences, their faces a mix of shock, amusement, and subtle triumph. Emma turned to me, whispering, "Mom, you just dismantled her entire personality in one sentence." I couldn't help but chuckle softly. Patience, Emma, let her marinate in it for a little while. Sometimes the lesson is more effective when the person is forced to realize it on their own. Karen's face went from pale to a dull red, a sort of rage-tinged embarrassment. She began mumbling, as if words themselves were betraying her. Rules, precedent, neighborhood safety. I took a step closer, still calm, still smiling. Karen, your concern for rules is admirable, but you must understand that real authority is different from self-appointed authority. Rules only matter when they're enforceable. Threats only matter when they carry weight. And today, yours carry none. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, I could see a flicker of fear in her eyes, a tiny spark of understanding that she had gone too far. I let the pause stretch, long enough to savor the satisfaction of her realization, long enough for the neighborhood to feel the drama unfold as if they were watching a live courtroom scene. The officers, still polite but clearly entertained, nodded subtly. One of them whispered to the other, probably commenting on how Karen had made the simplest family visit into an absurd legal circus. The young officer's shoulders twitched with suppressed laughter, and I had to bite back a grin. Karen finally found her voice, though it was barely audible, a shadow of the confidence she had started with. I didn't realize, You didn't realize because you never took the time to consider the situation fully, I said gently. You assumed authority automatically gave you correctness. It does. Actions have context, and context matters. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw Karen not as a fearsome neighborhood enforcer, but as someone entirely human, completely exposed. She had painted herself into a corner, and there was no wiggle room left. I gestured toward Emma. She is my daughter. She is visiting. That is all. There is no violation. And now, I suggest you return to your duties, responsibly and within the limits of your authority. The silence was absolute for a few moments, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves and the soft murmurs of neighbors trying to process what had just happened. Karen finally turned and walked back toward her house, muttering under her breath, a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. But the defeat was complete. Emma let out a quiet laugh. Wow, Mom, that was perfect. I smiled and ruffled her hair. Sometimes, Emma, people need to learn lessons without being humiliated outright, but seeing them face the consequences of their own arrogance is satisfying. The neighbors, emboldened by the drama, started talking quietly among themselves. Some gave discreet thumbs-ups as we walked inside. Others peeked over fences, grinning at Karen's retreat. I realized that while I hadn't needed to escalate, the neighborhood had already absorbed the spectacle, a silent acknowledgement that self-righteousness has limits. Even the officers left without further questions, a subtle nod indicating they now understood the situation fully. They had witnessed a unique kind of suburban justice, a lesson delivered calmly, firmly, and with perfect timing. Emma and I finally closed the door behind us, laughing quietly. "Do you think she'll ever come back with more rules?" she asked, still incredulous. "Maybe," I said, pouring us both a cup of coffee. "But next time she'll think twice, and sometimes that's enough." The weekend finally felt peaceful. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood was quiet. The tension, the absurdity, the spectacle, it had all passed, leaving behind satisfaction, humor, and a subtle reminder. People who wield power without understanding responsibility eventually learn that their authority has limits. And for Emma and me, this was a perfect reminder that patience, calmness, and timing could turn even the most ridiculous confrontation into a story worth remembering. A story of quiet triumph, suburban drama, and a little well-earned karmic justice. The storm had passed. The lesson had been delivered. And Karen, for all her bluster and blinding confidence, would not forget this driveway confrontation anytime soon. After the storm of Karen's driveway meltdown, the neighborhood felt almost surreal in its calm. It was quiet now, the kind of quiet that carries the weight of what just happened, a mix of tension, disbelief, and subtle triumph. Emma and I finally settled inside the house, laughing quietly over coffee as the adrenaline of the morning slowly faded. "Mom," Emma said, shaking her head, "I still can't believe she called the cops over a weekend visit." I chuckled. Some people take rules way too seriously, and when ego meets obsession, it becomes, well, an event. We looked out the window, and sure enough, neighbors were cautiously emerging from behind curtains, glancing toward Karen's house. Some waved discreetly, others whispered and shook their heads. Word of the confrontation was already spreading like wildfire through the cul-de-sac. The absurdity of Karen's actions, combined with the revelation of my position as a federal judge, made for a story that would be retold at every neighborhood barbecue for months to come. Emma sipped her coffee, smiling. "So, do you think she's actually going to follow the rules now?" I raised an eyebrow and smiled knowingly. She'll follow the rules, all right, but not because she wants to enforce them properly, because she now knows there are consequences for overstepping boundaries. The rest of the weekend passed peacefully. We played board games, shared meals, and laughed over small, personal stories. It was everything a visit should be: calm, relaxing, and free of unnecessary HOA drama. But the memory of Karen's meltdown lingered, a subtle reminder that human behavior is often as ridiculous as it is predictable. Late that afternoon, I received a text from one of the neighbors. "Saw what happened. Wow, Karen finally met someone who actually knows authority. Bravo," I smiled, tucking my phone away. The neighborhood had silently acknowledged the shift in dynamics. The era of unchecked Karen power had quietly ended. I reflected on the lessons of the confrontation. Patience, calm, and timing had been my strongest tools. Karen had been so focused on asserting authority that she failed to see context, intent, or consequence. She had weaponized rules without understanding their purpose, and it had backfired spectacularly. The lesson was simple: those who wield power without wisdom often undermine themselves. Emma leaned back in her chair, still giggling. "You were like a suburban superhero, Mom." I laughed. Maybe. Or maybe just a federal judge who knows how to handle a Karen. By evening, the neighborhood had returned to its usual quiet hum. Lawns were mowed, sprinklers ran, and the distant sound of children playing echoed softly. But somewhere on the cul-de-sac, Karen was surely replaying the events in her head, muttering about rules, forms, and procedures. And while she would undoubtedly continue to patrol her imaginary kingdom, she would now do so with a healthy dose of humility, or at least caution. I looked at Emma, who was gathering her things to leave the next day. "Remember," I said gently, "people will test you. They'll push boundaries and try to assert control in ways that make no sense. But you can't meet chaos with chaos. You have to meet it with calm, patience, and clarity. That's how you win. Emma nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the lesson in her own way. I think I get it, Mom. And wow, you really handled that perfectly. As she left, I walked to the front door, looking down the street. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac. I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, not from the drama itself, but from knowing that balance had been restored. Authority had been measured against overreach, patience had been rewarded, and a small but significant corner of the world was righted. And perhaps, most importantly, the story would live on in our family and in the neighborhood lore. Karen's meltdown, my calm reveal, and Emma's laughter were now forever etched in the collective memory of everyone who had witnessed it. As I closed the door behind me, I couldn't help but smile. Life in the suburbs can be absurd, stressful, and hilarious all at once. But when patience, timing, and a little humor are applied, even the most ridiculous confrontation can end with dignity, justice, and yes, a good story to tell. The storm had passed, the lesson had been delivered, and the cul-de-sac was finally at peace. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of her house, Karen was probably rewriting the HOA rulebook in her head, making sure she'd never underestimate another neighbor again. But this time, she would remember me, and she would think twice before ever crossing the line. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.